Foundations of Jurisprudence. Volume 0, The Architecture of Context. Chapter .01, The Missing Manual. Every system has a structure behind it, even when that structure is not visible. People feel the effects of that structure every day, but they rarely see the explanation that ties everything together. When the explanation is missing, the system still works, but the people inside it are left guessing. They rely on habits, assumptions, or whatever stories they've heard from others. This gap between how a system works and how people understand it is what we call the missing manual. A missing manual does not mean the system is broken. It simply means the explanation was never written down in a way ordinary people could see. The structure is there, but it is hidden. And when something important is hidden, people fill the space with whatever makes sense to them. They create their own explanations, even if those explanations don't match the real architecture. This is why different people can look at the same situation and come away with completely different ideas about what is happening. They are not seeing the structure. They are seeing their own interpretation of the structure. Without a shared manual, everyone builds their own version. Volume 0 begins by acknowledging this gap. It exists in every complex environment: legal systems, institutions, workplaces, communities. People feel the effects of structure long before they understand the structure itself. The purpose of this book is to make that structure visible. Not to tell anyone what to do, and not to judge how systems operate, but simply to show the architecture that has always been there. Once the structure becomes visible, the confusion begins to fade. People stop relying on assumptions and start seeing the relationships that actually shape the environment. This is the first step toward understanding the 7-book system that follows. Chapter .02, The Inversion Pattern. When people cannot see the real structure behind a system, they create substitutes. These substitutes are not accurate models, they are reflections of the missing explanation. They are guesses, stories, jokes, metaphors, or exaggerated ideas that fill the empty space where clarity should be. This is the inversion pattern. An inversion is not wrong. It is simply incomplete. It is what people create when they know something is happening beneath the surface, but cannot see the architecture that explains it. Inversions show that people recognize the presence of structure, even if they cannot describe it. You can see inversion patterns everywhere. When a process feels confusing, people joke about hidden rules. When an institution behaves unpredictably, people imagine motives or forces that may not exist. When a system feels too complex to understand, people create simplified versions that feel easier to grasp. These are all inversions, reflections of absence, not reflections of structure. The purpose of identifying the inversion pattern is not to criticize these substitutes. It is to recognize why they appear. They arise because the real architecture is not visible. Once the structure becomes clear, the need for inversions fades. People no longer have to guess. They can see the relationships for themselves. Volume 0 acknowledges these patterns so the reader can move past them. The goal is not to replace one interpretation with another, but to remove the need for interpretation altogether by making the structure visible. Chapter .03, The Cultural Void. When a system lacks a visible explanation, the absence does not stay empty. People fill it with stories, symbols, and shared beliefs that help them function inside the system. These cultural constructions are not structural descriptions. They are coping mechanisms, ways to navigate uncertainty when the architecture is hidden. This is the cultural void. The cultural void is not a flaw. It is a natural response to missing information. When people cannot see the structure, they create meaning in other ways. They build traditions, assumptions, and informal rules that help them make sense of what they experience. These interpretations vary from group to group, which is why different communities can have completely different understandings of the same system. The cultural void provides continuity, not clarity. It helps people operate day to day, but it cannot explain the architecture that shapes the environment. That is why cultural interpretations often conflict with each other. They are built on experience, not structure. Volume 0 identifies the cultural void so the reader can distinguish between cultural meaning and structural explanation. The goal is not to erase culture, but to show that culture fills the space where structure is missing. Once the architecture becomes visible, the cultural void no longer has to carry the weight of explanation. Chapter 04: The Shadow of Structure. Even when a system's architecture is hidden, its effects still show up in everyday life. People notice patterns, repeated outcomes, or limits that seem to appear no matter who is involved. These visible effects are the shadow of structure. A shadow is not the structure itself. It is only the outline, the part you can see when the real shape is still out of view. People recognize the shadow long before they understand what creates it. They see that certain things happen consistently, even if they cannot explain why. They feel the boundaries of the system without knowing where those boundaries come from. This is why people often misinterpret what they experience. When the structure is invisible, the shadow becomes the only thing they can observe. They try to explain the shadow as if it were the structure, but the shadow only shows the effects, not the relationships that produce them. This leads to incomplete models, mistaken assumptions, or explanations that feel right but do not match the real architecture. Volume 0 identifies the shadow of structure so the reader can separate what they see from what actually exists. The shadow tells you that a system is operating, but it cannot tell you how the system works. Once the architecture becomes visible, the shadow makes sense, not as a mystery, but as the natural result of the structure behind it. Chapter 05: The Need for Clarity. When people cannot see the structure behind a system, they rely on whatever explanations they can find. These explanations may come from experience, culture, or personal interpretation. They help people function, but they do not provide a shared understanding. Without clarity, everyone builds their own version of the system, and those versions rarely match. Clarity does not change the system. It simply reveals what is already there. It replaces assumptions with structure. It gives people a stable reference so they no longer have to guess. When clarity is missing, confusion grows. People misread situations, misunderstand decisions, or assume motives that have nothing to do with the real architecture. The need for clarity is not about correcting anyone. It is about giving people the tools to see the system as it actually operates. Once the structure becomes visible, people can distinguish between what is part of the architecture and what is part of their own interpretation. This shift is essential for understanding the 7-book system. Volume 0 identifies the need for clarity because clarity is the foundation for everything that follows. Without it, the reader would approach the system with assumptions instead of structure. With it, the reader can move forward with confidence. Chapter 06: The 7-book Architecture. The 7-book system is a way of making complex environments understandable. Each volume focuses on one part of the structure, and together they form a complete picture. The system does not tell people what to do. It simply shows how the architecture works so the reader can see the relationships that shape the environment. The architecture is built around 7 components. Authority: how decisions begin and who has the power to make them. Influence: how preferences, pressures, and incentives shape outcomes. Order: the rules and stabilizing forces that keep systems consistent. Reality: the information, perception, and environment in which decisions occur. Change: how systems evolve, adapt, or break down over time. The architecture of absence: the effects created by what is missing, undefined, or unseen. The architecture of ethics: the boundaries that define responsibility and legitimacy. Each volume stands on its own, but none is complete alone. Authority shapes influence. Influence shapes order. Order shapes reality. Reality shapes change. Absence shapes everything that is not visible. Ethics shapes everything that is allowed to happen. The books are interdependent, and the sequence is intentional. Volume 0 does not analyze these components. It prepares the reader to understand them. It introduces the architecture so the reader can approach each volume without projecting assumptions or cultural interpretations onto the system. Once the structure becomes visible, the 7-book system becomes a map instead of a mystery. Chapter 0.07, the reader's orientation. A structural system can only be understood when the reader approaches it with the right mindset. Without this orientation, the material may be misread as argument, opinion, or commentary. The purpose of this chapter is to help the reader see the system as it is meant to be seen, as a description of structure, not a set of conclusions. The system does not promote outcomes. It does not tell the reader what should happen. It simply shows how the architecture operates. To read it accurately, the reader must set aside expectations, assumptions, and personal interpretations. The system uses neutral language, so the reader does not drift into emotional or cultural meaning. The reader should also understand that no single volume explains everything. Each book describes one part of the architecture. The full picture only appears when all 7 components are understood together. The correct orientation is one of observation, not judgment. Volume 0 establishes this orientation so the reader can engage with the system clearly and consistently. Once the reader adopts this posture, the architecture becomes easier to see. Chapter 0.08, the neutral tone. When you describe a structure, the tone matters. If the explanation leans toward emotion, opinion, or persuasion, the reader begins to look for meaning that isn't actually there. They start searching for arguments, motives, or judgments instead of seeing the architecture itself. That is why a neutral tone is essential. Neutrality does not mean cold or distant. It simply means the explanation does not push the reader toward a conclusion. It does not suggest what should happen or how someone should feel about the system. It stays focused on what exists, the relationships, the boundaries, and the patterns that shape the environment. A neutral tone keeps the reader grounded. It prevents the material from being misread as commentary or advice. It allows the structure to speak for itself. When the tone is steady and clear, the reader can observe the architecture without being pulled toward interpretation. Volume 0 uses this tone so the reader can understand the system without distraction. The goal is clarity, not persuasion. Once the reader becomes familiar with this style, the rest of the 7-book system becomes easier to follow. Chapter 0.09, the purpose of the system. The 7-book system exists for one reason, to make structure visible. It does not try to solve problems or direct behavior. It does not tell the reader what choices to make. Instead, it reveals the relationships that shape complex environments so the reader can understand the conditions in which decisions occur. When structure is invisible, people rely on personal experience or cultural stories to explain what they see. These explanations may feel accurate, but they rarely match the architecture that actually governs the system. The 7-book system replaces these informal models with a clear, consistent framework. The system is descriptive, not prescriptive. It does not recommend strategies or evaluate outcomes. It simply shows how authority, influence, order, reality, change, absence, and ethics interact. Once the reader sees these relationships, the environment becomes easier to understand. The purpose of the system is clarity. Clarity allows the reader to separate structure from interpretation. It allows them to see patterns that were previously hidden. And it prepares them to engage with the rest of the series without relying on assumptions. Volume 0 establishes this purpose so the reader knows what to expect. The system provides visibility, not direction. Chapter 0.10, the boundary conditions. Every structural system needs boundaries. Without them, the material can be misread as argument, advice, or prediction. Boundary conditions define what the system does and does not address. They keep the explanation focused and prevent confusion. The 7-book system stays within clear limits. It describes relationships, but it does not tell anyone how to act. It uses neutral language, so the reader does not drift into emotional or cultural meaning. It does not analyze motives or intentions. It does not rely on specific historical or political examples. It does not predict outcomes or define what should happen. These boundaries keep the system stable. They ensure that the material remains descriptive rather than interpretive. They allow the reader to understand the architecture without mixing it with personal or cultural assumptions. Volume 0 establishes these boundaries so the reader can approach the system with the right expectations. The architecture is clear, but it is not a set of instructions. It is a framework for understanding, not a guide for decision-making. Chapter 11, the relationship to fiction. When people cannot see the structure behind a system, they often turn to stories to fill the gap. Fiction becomes a way to express the feeling of interacting with something complex and unseen. These stories are not descriptions of the system. They are reflections of the uncertainty created by missing structure. Fiction often highlights themes like hidden mechanisms, unseen forces, or mysterious patterns. These themes appear because they mirror the experience of living inside a system without a manual. The stories help people make sense of the unknown, even if they do not reveal the architecture itself. The relationship between fiction and structure is indirect. Fiction shows the emotional or cultural response to missing information. It reveals the presence of absence, not the form of the system. It can illustrate how people feel when they cannot see the architecture, but it cannot replace a structural explanation. Volume 0 acknowledges this relationship so the reader does not confuse symbolic narratives with actual structure. The 7-book system is not based on fiction. It is based on the architecture that exists beneath the surface. Fiction helps us understand the effects of missing structure, but it cannot show the structure itself. Chapter 12, the relationship to jurisprudence. Jurisprudence is the study of how rules gain meaning, how authority is interpreted, and how decisions are justified within a legal framework. It gives people a vocabulary for talking about law, power, and interpretation. The 7-book system is not a legal theory, but it intersects with jurisprudence in an important way. Both are concerned with structure. Jurisprudence focuses on interpretation, how rules are understood, applied, and explained. It looks at how meaning is created inside a legal system. The 7-book system focuses on architecture, the relationships that exist before interpretation even begins. It describes the environment in which decisions happen, not the decisions themselves. These two perspectives are connected but distinct. Jurisprudence explains how rules function once they exist. The 7-book system explains the conditions that make rules, authority, and interpretation possible in the first place. One deals with meaning. The other deals with structure. Volume 0 identifies this relationship so the reader does not confuse the system with legal doctrine. The 7-book architecture does not interpret laws, evaluate justice, or analyze cases. It simply describes the structural environment in which all of those things occur. Understanding this distinction helps the reader approach the system without expecting legal guidance or moral conclusions. Chapter 13, the restoration of structure. When people cannot see the architecture behind a system, they fill the space with assumptions, stories, or symbolic explanations. These substitutes help them function, but they do not provide a unified understanding. Restoring structure means replacing these informal models with a clear description of the relationships that actually shape the environment. Restoration does not change the system. It reveals what has always been there. The architecture exists whether people understand it or not. When the structure becomes visible, the reader can separate what is part of the system from what is part of their own interpretation. Restoring structure requires 3 things: visibility. The relationships must be described clearly. Neutrality. The explanation must avoid emotional or persuasive framing. Consistency. The framework must apply across environments without relying on specific examples. When these conditions are met, the reader can finally see the system as a whole. They no longer have to rely on cultural narratives or personal assumptions. They can understand the architecture directly without guessing. Volume 0 identifies the restoration of structure as the turning point between interpretation and understanding. Once the structure becomes visible, the reader is ready to engage with the 7-book system as a complete architectural model. Chapter 14, the method of reading. A structural system requires a steady way of reading. Without a clear method, The reader may slip into habits that distort the material, treating it like a story, an argument, or a set of instructions. The method of reading ensures that the system is understood as architecture. The system should be read as a description of relationships. Each chapter introduces a piece of the structure. These pieces are not arguments or claims. They are parts of a larger framework. The reader's task is to observe the relationships, not to judge them or search for hidden meaning. The system should also be read in order. Each volume builds on the one before it. Skipping ahead or reading sections in isolation can lead to confusion because the necessary context has not yet been established. The architecture is layered, and the layers depend on each other. Finally, the reader should avoid projecting familiar ideas onto the system. Concepts from law, politics, psychology, or culture may resemble parts of the architecture, but they are not the same. The system uses its own definitions. Understanding requires meeting the material on its own terms. Volume 0 establishes this method of reading so the reader can move through the 7-book system with clarity. Once the reader adopts this approach, the architecture becomes easier to see. Chapter 0.15 Transition into Volume 1. Volume 0 prepares the reader to understand a structural system. It identifies the missing manual, the inversion patterns that fill the gaps, and the need for clarity before examining the architecture itself. With these foundations in place, the reader is ready to enter the first volume. Volume 1 begins with authority, the starting point of all structure. Authority determines who can make decisions, how those decisions begin, and what boundaries shape them. Every other component of the system depends on authority. Influence, order, reality, change, absence, and ethics all operate within the conditions authority creates. The transition into Volume 1 marks the shift from context to structure. Volume 0 does not analyze authority. It simply prepares the reader to understand it. The material that follows is descriptive, neutral, and sequential. Each chapter builds on the last, and clarity depends on maintaining the orientation established in this introductory volume. Volume 0 ends at the threshold. Volume 1 begins the architecture.